Imagine you're a Roman senator walking through the Suburra, Rome's infamous pleasure district, when you notice a familiar figure servicing clients in a common brothel. Your blood runs cold as you recognize the delicate features beneath the cheap makeup. This isn't just any prostitute. This is Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife of Emperor Claudius, willingly degrading herself for the thrill of anonymous encounters with the city's lowest citizens. This wasn't some desperate woman forced into prostitution. This was the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire, sneaking out of the palace at night to compete with common prostitutes, determined to prove she could outlast any woman in sexual endurance. You think you know about Roman decadence. What you're about to discover about Messalina will make Caligula look like a choir boy. Because Rome's third empress didn't just abuse her power, she weaponized her sexuality in ways that would terrorize an empire and ultimately seal her own horrific fate. In the year 38 CE, Rome celebrated what appeared to be the perfect imperial wedding. Valeria Messalina, barely 15 years old, married Emperor Claudius in a ceremony that symbolized everything Romans valued: nobility, fertility, and the continuation of divine bloodlines. She was everything an empress should be: young, beautiful, from an ancient patrician family, and capable of providing the empire with legitimate heirs. Claudius, 13 years her senior and physically disabled from what modern medicine recognizes as cerebral palsy, seemed grateful to have secured such a prize. Contemporary accounts describe Messalina as possessing classical Roman beauty, pale skin, golden hair, and the refined features that marked aristocratic breeding. She fulfilled her imperial duties perfectly, bearing Claudius's 2 children and appearing at state functions with appropriate dignity. Roman society operated under strict moral codes that divided women into rigid categories. Virtuous wives and mothers occupied the highest tier, while prostitutes and entertainers existed at the bottom of social hierarchy. An empress was expected to embody feminine virtue so completely that even rumors of impropriety could destabilize the government. The contrast between public expectation and private reality made Messalina's behavior not just scandalous, but genuinely dangerous to imperial stability. But behind the marble walls of the Palatine Palace, something far darker was developing. The young woman who smiled graciously during religious ceremonies and hosted dignified dinner parties was secretly planning nocturnal adventures that would shock even jaded Roman aristocrats who thought they had seen every form of excess imaginable. The transformation began subtly during Messalina's first year as empress, when palace servants started noticing peculiar changes in her behavior. She would dismiss her guards at unusual hours, claiming fatigue, then emerge from her chambers wearing simple clothes that concealed her identity. Initially, her nocturnal wanderings seemed like harmless rebellion, a young woman seeking adventure outside the suffocating protocols of palace life. But Messalina's midnight excursions quickly evolved from innocent escapism into something far more calculated and disturbing. She began studying the routines of Rome's prostitutes, learning their techniques, their territories, and their clients. This wasn't casual observation. She was conducting research with the methodical precision of a military campaign. The first documented incident occurred during the Saturnalia festival of 40 CE, when traditional social roles were temporarily reversed and normal moral restrictions relaxed. While Claudius attended religious ceremonies, Messalina disguised herself as a common citizen and ventured into the Suburra district. What started as curiosity about how ordinary Romans lived became an obsession with proving her sexual superiority over professional entertainers. Contemporary historian Tacitus recorded whispered accounts from palace insiders who discovered Messalina's deception. she had approached a brothel keeper, offering to work anonymously for a single night. The proprietor, unaware of her true identity, accepted what appeared to be an aristocratic woman seeking excitement, but Messalina's performance that night exceeded anything the establishment had witnessed. She serviced more clients than their most experienced workers, displaying an appetite that shocked even professionals accustomed to extreme demands. When dawn approached and other prostitutes stopped working, Messalina refused to leave. She demanded more clients, more challenges, more opportunities to demonstrate that an empress could outperform any common prostitute. The brothel keeper finally forced her to depart, but the damage was done. Messalina had discovered her true calling. Within months of her first brothel experience, Messalina had developed a systematic approach to her nocturnal activities that revealed the calculating mind behind her apparent madness. She established a network of trusted servants who would smuggle her out of the palace, arranged for disguises that completely transformed her appearance, and created false identities that allowed her to move freely through Rome's underground sexual economy. But simple prostitution wasn't enough to satisfy Messalina's competitive nature. She began organizing contests between herself and Rome's most renowned courtesans, wagering enormous sums on her ability to service more clients in a single night than any professional. These competitions weren't private affairs. They attracted audiences of wealthy Romans who gathered to watch their empress degrade herself for entertainment. The most infamous of these contests occurred in 41 CE when Messalina challenged Sila, Rome's most celebrated prostitute, to an endurance competition. The rules were straightforward. Whoever could service the most clients between sunset and dawn would win a fortune in gold. Roman nobility packed the venue, placing bets while watching their emperor's wife compete like a gladiator in an arena of flesh. Sila, a professional with years of experience, paced herself carefully throughout the night. She had developed techniques for managing clients efficiently while conserving her strength for the long competition ahead. By dawn, she had serviced 25 clients and declared herself exhausted but victorious. Messalina was just getting started. Even after Sila conceded defeat, the empress continued accepting new clients, driven by a compulsion that went far beyond mere sexual appetite. Historical accounts suggest she ultimately serviced over 30 men that night, stopping only when no more volunteers could be found. Her victory wasn't celebrated. It was witnessed in horrified silence by Romans who realized they were watching something unprecedented and deeply disturbing. The psychological implications were staggering. This wasn't a desperate woman forced into degrading circumstances. This was the most powerful woman in the world choosing humiliation as entertainment. Messalina had discovered that her imperial status made debasement more thrilling, not less. The greater the contrast between her public dignity and private degradation, the more intense her satisfaction became. But these public competitions were just the beginning of Messalina's descent into systematic perversion that would eventually threaten the stability of the entire Roman government. But if you think Messalina's prostitution contests were shocking, you're not prepared for what happened when she decided to make her sexual obsessions permanent. What I'm about to describe will make everything you just heard seem like innocent experimentation compared to the systematic operation she was planning. Before we dive into the most disturbing part, subscribe and hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next. And definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I think it's incredible that people across the world are connected by the same curiosity about the darkest parts of human history. The next phase would transform Rome's empress into something far more dangerous than a sexual competitor. In 42C, Messalina crossed a line that transformed her from scandalous empress into genuine threat to imperial security. She established what historians would later call the most audacious criminal enterprise in Roman history, a high-end brothel operating under imperial protection, staffed by aristocratic women and serving the city's most powerful men. The operation was hidden in plain sight within a luxurious villa near the campus marshes, disguised as a private club for elite social gatherings. Messalina used her imperial authority to recruit participants, essentially blackmailing noble women into joining her establishment under threat of political or financial ruin for their families. What appeared to be voluntary participation was actually coercion backed by the full power of the imperial throne. Messalina's criminal genius lay in her client selection. Rather than serving random customers like common prostitutes, she deliberately targeted senators, military commanders, and wealthy merchants who possessed information valuable to imperial interests. Every encounter was documented by hidden servants who recorded conversations, identified weaknesses, and gathered intelligence that Messalina could later use for political manipulation. The Empress had essentially created a honey trap operation that made her one of the most informed individuals in the Roman Empire. She knew which senators were planning to oppose imperial policies, which military commanders harbored treasonous thoughts, and which merchants were evading taxes or smuggling goods. This information network gave Messalina unprecedented power over the very men who should have been governing the empire alongside her husband. Her methods were sophisticated and psychologically devastating. She would identify targets through careful observation at state functions, then arrange for them to be invited to exclusive gatherings at her villa. Once inside, guests would be offered increasingly exotic entertainment, culminating in encounters with aristocratic women whose identities were revealed only after compromising acts had been performed and documented. The psychological impact on her victims was calculated and cruel. Discovering they had unknowingly engaged with the Empress herself, or with wives and daughters of their political allies, created layers of blackmail that ensured absolute silence and compliance. Messalina had turned sexual shame into political control, creating a web of compromised officials who dared not oppose her wishes. But the most disturbing aspect of her operation was how it corrupted the fundamental relationships that held Roman society together. She forced aristocratic women to betray their class, coerced political leaders to act against their principles, and transformed the sacred bonds of marriage and family into tools of manipulation and control. Foreign ambassadors began reporting strange irregularities in Roman policy decisions that seemed to favor specific individuals without logical explanation. Military appointments went to unqualified candidates who somehow possessed the Empress's support. Trade agreements benefited merchants who had no apparent connection to imperial interests. The empire's decision-making process had been quietly subverted by a brothel madam who happened to be married to the emperor. Even this systematic corruption was nothing compared to what happened when Messalina decided that operating in secret wasn't exciting enough anymore. By 44 C, Messalina's appetite for power and perversion had grown beyond anything that could be satisfied through secret operations. She began organizing elaborate public orgies that served as both entertainment and political theater, forcing Rome's elite to participate in degrading spectacles that cemented her control over the empire's leadership. These events weren't spontaneous parties, but carefully orchestrated displays of imperial power disguised as religious festivals. Messalina would claim to be honoring various gods and goddesses, requiring attendance from senators, their wives, and other high-ranking officials under the pretext of fulfilling civic duties. What began as formal religious observances would gradually transform into scenes of systematic sexual humiliation. The empress had developed techniques for gradually escalating these gatherings from dignified ceremonies into something far more sinister. She would begin with traditional rituals, then introduce increasingly intimate elements claimed to be authentic ancient practices. By the time participants realized what was happening, they were already too compromised to object without admitting their own participation in activities that violated every principle of Roman morality. Messalina's psychological manipulation reached its peak during these events. She understood that forcing aristocratic men and women to degrade themselves publicly created bonds of shared shame that prevented them from later opposing her authority. Everyone who participated became complicit in maintaining the fiction that these gatherings were legitimate religious observances rather than imperial sex parties. The most horrifying accounts describe Messalina forcing political rivals to perform with each other while she watched and provided commentary. Senators who had opposed imperial policies found themselves naked and degraded before their colleagues, their dignity destroyed, and their authority permanently compromised. She had discovered that sexual humiliation was more effective than execution for neutralizing political opposition. But perhaps most disturbing was how Messalina began incorporating younger participants into these events. Palace records suggest she recruited adolescent sons and daughters of prominent families, claiming their participation was necessary for religious authenticity. These young people, raised to obey imperial authority without question, became unwilling participants in their own exploitation. The empress had created a system where opposing her required admitting participation in activities that would destroy entire family lines. Parents couldn't protect their children without confessing their own involvement. Political leaders couldn't expose her crimes without revealing their own complicity. She had essentially made herself untouchable through systematic blackmail that encompassed the entire Roman ruling class. Foreign observers began noting the strange behavior of Roman officials during diplomatic negotiations. Previously confident senators seemed nervous and submissive. Military commanders appeared distracted and fearful. The empire's leadership had been psychologically broken by an empress who understood that sexual shame was more powerful than military force for controlling human behavior. In 48 C, Messalina's obsession with power and scandal reached its ultimate expression when she committed an act so unprecedented that it shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial excess. While Emperor Claudius was away in Ostia overseeing grain shipments, Messalina held a full wedding ceremony with Gacilius, a handsome young senator she had been pursuing for months. This wasn't a secret affair or symbolic ritual. It was a legal Roman marriage complete with religious ceremonies, official witnesses, and formal contracts. Messalina had essentially declared herself divorced from the emperor and remarried to another man while still holding the title of empress. The legal and political implications were staggering, as Roman law recognized her new marriage as legitimate, while she simultaneously remained Claudius's wife. The wedding celebration became a multi-day orgy that included most of Rome's remaining uncorrupted aristocracy, finally forcing even her most compromised allies to acknowledge that Messalina had crossed into open rebellion against imperial authority. She had stopped pretending her activities were private indulgences or religious observances. This was a direct challenge to the emperor's authority and the stability of the empire itself. Messalina's psychological state during this period suggests complete disconnection from reality. She began referring to Silius as emperor and herself as his empress, apparently believing she could simply replace Claudius through the force of her will and the compliance of her blackmail victims. She started issuing orders in Silas's name and planning a formal coronation ceremony that would legitimize their rule. The young senator, initially flattered by the empress's attention, found himself trapped in a nightmare of imperial ambition and sexual obsession. He had become the focal point of Messalina's ultimate fantasy, not just sexual domination, but complete political transformation of the Roman Empire according to her perverted vision. Historical accounts suggest he began planning escape routes, realizing too late that he had become a pawn in her deadly game. Meanwhile, Claudius remained unaware of his wife's marriage until loyal freedmen risked their lives to inform him of the crisis. The emperor's initial reaction was disbelief. Even for Messalina, bigamy while holding imperial office seemed impossible. But as evidence mounted, including witness testimony and official documents, Claudius realized he faced not just personal betrayal, but potential civil war. The confrontation came swiftly and brutally. Claudius returned to Rome with loyal troops and confronted Messalina in the gardens where she was celebrating her new marriage. Contemporary accounts describe her final moments as a mixture of defiance and terror. As she realized her web of blackmail and sexual control had finally encountered a force stronger than shame, imperial survival instinct. Messalina's execution was swift, but her erasure was systematic. Claudius ordered her name removed from all public monuments, her images destroyed, and her memory condemned through damnatio memorialia, official forgetting that made discussing her existence treasonous. The empress, who had used sexual power to control an empire, was herself controlled through the ultimate expression of state power. Her death marked the end of an era when sexual scandals had nearly replaced political competence as the driving force of imperial governance. If this exploration of power's darkest expressions has left you questioning what other buried truths lurk in history's shadows, click the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that authorities tried to erase. Subscribe to continue uncovering the horrific realities behind civilization's most carefully constructed lies.